The first thing I noticed when the dropship ramp lowered was that the light was the wrong color. Andrathvel's outer ring was supposed to be sealed. The Vashari built their citadel stations to survive hull breach, fire, atmospheric decompression. They had been building them for 600 years, longer than humanity had been reaching for orbit. But the Kethsaron blockade fleet had been in low orbit for 11 days, and 11 days at close range with suppression weapons designed to fracture lattice alloy superstructure had done what no one expected. The outer observation ring was open to the sky. Amber sky, actually. Andrath below us was a warm planet, copper-colored oceans, rust-brown landmass, and the light that came through the gap in the hull was the color of old brass, and it fell across a floor that should not have existed at all. The outer ring should have vented. And yet here it was, still holding atmosphere through some accident of the Vashari's build quality, and the light lay across everything in long amber bars, and it was beautiful in the way that wrecks are sometimes beautiful. I had approximately 4 seconds to register that beauty before I was down the ramp and moving. Had an outer ring. Kessler takes the council chamber, Yun takes medical, go. That was Lieutenant Commander Merritt on the command channel, already 200 meters ahead with the boarding party, and I went. My name is Senior Corpsman Rail Haddon, ESV Unyielding Patience, United Alliance Emergency Navy's Medical Escort Division. I had been a combat medic for 11 years at that point. I had worked 9 active rescue operations, 2 of them under fire, 1 of them in hard vacuum, 1 of them on a planet that was actively trying to collapse its own atmosphere. I mention this not because it matters to the tactical account, but because it sets the register. I do not flap. I do not editorialize. I do my job and I write my reports and I go home. I am writing this report now because Commander Merritt asked me to, and because the operations log from Andrathvel has 11 gaps in it that correspond to 11 places where the recording equipment had been knocked offline by suppression fire, and somebody needs to fill those gaps, and I was present in most of them. So here is what I saw. The outer ring of Andrathvel was 60 meters wide and curved in a gentle arc. You could see the curve if you stood at one end and looked toward the other, which I did briefly because I needed to see the whole space at once before I moved into it. The ring had been a promenade. There were still benches along the interior wall, long flat crystalline benches of the kind the Vashari prefer, a species that is itself lattice-bodied and translucent, doesn't build soft furniture. Everything they make has the feel of beautiful mineral structure, chairs and tables that look like they were grown rather than manufactured. Some of the benches were intact. Others had been shattered by concussive pressure transfer from the suppression hits, and the fragments lay in long bright spills across the deck, catching the amber light from the gap overhead and scattering it in every direction. There were bodies. I will not be clinical about that, because there is no clinical way to describe a Vashari who has died from depressurization trauma. Their lattice structure, the mineral skeleton beneath the translucent tissue holds. It is engineered to hold, but the soft matter doesn't, and when a Vashari dies from sudden pressure differential, what you find is the lattice standing upright, or nearly so, and the rest of it gone, and the lattice still lit at the joints from the bioluminescence that doesn't quite stop immediately after death. The light fades slowly. In the outer ring of Andrathvel that morning, the dead were still glowing, amber-lit from above, fading from within. I counted 11 of them before I reached the first living one. She was pressed into a corner where 2 intact sections of the hull met, in a pocket of space that had somehow maintained just enough atmospheric seal to keep her alive. Vashari female, by the carapace coloring, a deep iridescent green along the secondary lattice lines. She was in administrative robes, not the heavy crisis suits that the station's emergency protocols should have distributed, which told me the depressurization event had happened faster than the alarms, consistent with the suppression weapon signature we'd been tracking from the Unyielding Patience's sensor suite during approach. She was conscious. Her bioluminescent nodes were flickering at a frequency I didn't have the cultural vocabulary to read precisely, but the fact of flickering was good. A non-flickering Vashari in her condition would have been neurologically compromised. "Korsman," I said, and held up the universal medical indicator, a pattern of 3 lights in a triangle that the Alliance had standardized across member species as meaning, "I am here to help, I am not a threat, indicate your status." She looked at it for a long moment. Then one of her upper limbs moved, and she held up 2 fingers on one hand and one on the other. 2 injured, 1 critical. There were others with her that I hadn't seen in the darkness of the corner. I went to work. The 2 injured were walking wounded, lattice stress fractures in the lower limbs, which in a Vashari are painful and debilitating but not life-threatening. The 1 critical was a council aide, young, male by his coloring, with a penetrating trauma from a fragment, something from the outer hull when it failed, that had gone through the soft tissue between 2 lattice sections on his right side. The lattice had held, which had kept his internals more or less where they belonged, but the fragment was still in place, and the pressure around it was wrong in a way I could feel through my gloves when I examined it. I had trained for Vashari anatomy for 40 hours in the week before we departed from Meridian Station. I had spent another 12 hours in the simulator running fragment extractions on a Vashari tissue model that the UAEN Medical Corps had built specifically for this operation. 40 hours and 12 hours is not enough. There is no amount of time that is enough, not for a species whose biology is as far from human as the Vasharis. But it is the amount of time I had, and I used it the way you use the time you have, completely. The extraction took 6 minutes. I needed Orvetti to hold counterpressure on the left side of the lattice section while I worked, and I needed Korsman Usul to manage the tissue sealant because my hands couldn't leave the extraction site, and we did it as a team in a corner of a broken promenade in the amber light. And at the end of it, the council aids diagnostic read stable across all monitored functions. I sent a status ping on the command channel, 3 wounded stabilized, 1 critical now stable, outer ring section 7 delta, and moved on. I want to step back here, because the tactical account is not the whole account, and Commander Merritt specifically asked me to write the whole account. The Vashari sent their distress plea 36 days before we arrived at Andrath Vel. They sent it on 38 separate secure channels, 1 for each of the major governance bodies in the known Assembly of Worlds. I know this because I read the full signal text during the transit from Meridian Station, because I wanted to understand who we were going to help, and why they needed help, and what they had tried before they called us. The plea was formal and precise, and very clearly desperate in the way that formal, precise documents can be desperate, the desperation visible only in the gaps, the places where the language tightened slightly, where the phrasing became more careful than it needed to be for a purely procedural communication. The Vashari Council of Cartographers had notified the 38 Assembly Councils that the Kethsoran sovereignty had initiated a blockade action in violation of 3 separate navigation treaties and 1 ceasefire compact, that the blockade had already cost lives, that the Citadel Ring Andrath Vel was sustaining structural damage from suppression weapons, and that without intervention, the Vashari home system would fall to an unauthorized occupation within 60 days. They asked for 3 things: diplomatic intervention, evacuation support if necessary, and a ceasefire monitoring presence. 3 things, reasonable things, the kind of things the Assembly of Worlds was built to provide. Here is the response they received. 7 councils sent formal expressions of concern. 9 councils sent nothing at all. 4 councils sent requests for additional documentation before they could consider action. 3 councils sent observers who departed after the Kethsoran fleet refused to grant them transit clearance, which is itself a violation of monitoring rights, but the councils in question decided not to escalate that point. One council sent a formal offer to mediate, conditional on both parties agreeing, which the Keth Sauron sovereignty declined, because they were winning and they knew it. The remaining 14 councils did not respond on the primary channel. 5 of those did not respond on any channel. 38 councils, not one sent a ship. I want to be precise about that because I have seen some summaries of the Andrath Vel situation that say the assembly failed to respond in time in the passive voice, as if time were the variable. Time was not the variable. 38 councils received a distress signal with 60 days on the clock and chose, each of them individually, not to act. At 24 hours, not one ship. At 72 hours, not one ship. At a week and 2 weeks and 3 weeks, not one ship. The clock ran down in full view of 38 separate bodies with the capacity to halt it, and not one of them moved. There is one more piece of context that I read during that transit, and I will mention it here because it is relevant, and because I am trying to write the complete account. The Vashari Council of Cartographers had, in the previous 40 years, submitted formal position papers to the Assembly on 7 separate occasions arguing against the admission of humanity to the Assembly as a full voting member. The arguments varied across the 7 papers but reduced to the same core objections. Humans were too recent a spacefaring species to be granted voting status. Human governance structures were too fragmented to represent a coherent policy position. The precedent set by early human admission would destabilize the Assembly's membership criteria for a generation. The 7th paper, submitted 18 months before the Andrath Vel crisis, had been presented by senior diplomat Vashari Vel Catholic, who was by then the Vashari's most prominent advocate before the Assembly and one of the most respected diplomatic voices in the known settled systems. The paper had been thorough, carefully argued, and by all accounts persuasive. Humanity's observer status in the Assembly had been reduced, not elevated, in the session that followed its presentation. I had read Vashari Vel Catholic's name at the bottom of that paper during my transit, and I had filed it in the part of my mind where I put things that are relevant to my job but not to my feelings about my job. And then I had put the document down and gone to sleep, because we had 4 more days of transit, and I needed the rest. That is the context. I mention it once here, and I will not mention it again in this report. The outer ring of Andrath Vel had 7 sections. I worked through 4 of them in the first 2 hours, with Corpsman Orvetti moving ahead of me to identify survivors and Corpsman Usul covering medical supply transport from the dropship. We found 31 survivors across those 4 sections. We stabilized 28. 3 were gone before I reached them, and there was no amount of preparation or speed that would have changed that. I've verified it against the suppression weapon timeline 3 separate times. The command channel was busy. Merritt's team had reached the council chamber on the inner ring and found it intact but sealed. The Vashari had emergency locked it from the inside at some point during the initial blockade action, which was tactically sound, and had kept the council alive. But it also meant Merritt's team was working through the unlock sequence on a channel that the Keth Sauron might or might not be monitoring, and the Vashari interior on the other side of that seal had been without reliable communication for 11 days. And the unlock procedure required verification from both sides. While Merritt worked that, I worked my side. Section 4 of the outer ring gave us 8 survivors in 2 groups. The first group, 5, clustered near the environmental control panel at the section's midpoint, had been in good shape relative to what I'd found in sections 1 through 3. No penetrating trauma, 2 stress fractures between them, 3 cases of low-grade pressure exposure that needed treatment and rest but not immediate surgical intervention. The second group was harder. 3 Vashari, a maintenance technician and 2 archival staff, in a subcompartment off the main promenade that had been sealed by a manually thrown bolt rather than the automatic pressure protocols. Someone in that compartment had understood what was happening to the station fast enough to throw a manual bolt, and that person had died anyway. I found a fourth lattice in the subcompartment, nodes dark, no soft matter remaining, and the three they had sealed in with them were alive. The youngest, an archival assistant whose carapace coloring put her at early professional age, had been in the compartment for 11 days with 2 liters of stored drinking fluid and a rack of archival tablets that she had apparently spent most of the time reading. She was dehydrated and showing the early signs of nutritional depletion, but her lattice was structurally intact and her nodes were running clear. She looked at me when I came through the subcompartment hatch and said something that the translator rendered as, "I estimated you would come on day 9. I was wrong by 2 days." I gave her a fluid pack and a nutritional supplement from the field kit and told her she could take the tablets when she transferred to the Covenant. She seemed to be weighing whether that was a promise or a medical assessment. I told her it was both. Section 5 gave us 4 survivors in a maintenance corridor that had been sealed by a secondary pressure door when the outer hull failed. Whoever had hit that door switch in the first moments of the breach had saved 4 lives and would never know it, because the door switch was automated and logged to a system that had been offline for 9 days. The 4 were in worse shape than most. They had been in the corridor for 11 days with no access to the station's emergency supply caches, which were distributed through the main promenade rather than the service corridors, and their nutritional and fluid reserves were critically depleted. One of them, a structural engineer named Vilithsor by the identification badge still clipped to his crisis suit, was in the early stages of lattice mineral loss, a condition the cultural briefing had described as analogous to what happens to bones in extended microgravity, but faster and more debilitating in a species whose skeleton is also their primary biological architecture. He could walk, just. I had him on a carry frame within 2 minutes of assessing him. Section 6 gave us 3 more, in a storage compartment lined with the mineral composite material the Vashari use for archival storage, which had proven, accidentally, to be an excellent pressure buffer. All 3 were walking wounded, and one of them, when I told her the evacuation was underway, and that the fleet was above us and the Kethsaron were holding position, sat down on a composite storage case, and did not move for approximately 45 seconds while her nodes cycled through something that I could not read precisely, but which I recognized as a person processing the end of something they had stopped believing would end. I let her sit. We had time, not unlimited time, but enough time for 45 seconds of that. Section 7, the last, gave us none. I want to account for that correctly. Section 7 of the outer ring was the section nearest the initial suppression impact zone. The pressure event there had been faster and more complete than in the other sections. The outer hull of Section 7 was gone, not breached but gone, a clean structural failure across 30 meters of hull that had vented the entire section in approximately 4 seconds by my reconstruction from the structural damage pattern. I walked Section 7 in my suit with Orvetti, and we found 9 lattice structures still upright in the amber light and the open air, some of them with their nodes still faintly lit, and we logged them and we departed, because there was nothing else to do there. From the hull gap in Section 7, the view was clearest. I could see the Kethsaron blockade ships at 400 kilometers, 6 of them in their loose ring, not moving, and I could see, at a greater distance and much more clearly than the blockade ships, the UAEN relief fleet. The Covenant of Ours. I want to describe her properly, because she is the reason the Kethsaron held position rather than pressing an engagement, and that fact is not incidental. She is designated a hospital frigate, which is technically accurate and practically misleading. The UAEN built her on a Vashari frame, a hull standard originally developed for long-duration heavy support operations in hostile approach corridors, meaning the hull was designed to go into places that didn't want it and stay there. When the UAEN converted the Vashari frame for medical service, They kept the deflection plating. They kept the sensor arrays. They kept the power core rated for a ship 3 times her displacement, because a hospital ship at the edge of its operational range in a hostile system needs power reserves that a peacetime medical vessel doesn't. What they added was the medical module system, a pressurized secondary hull that folds against the main spine in transit and deploys in system as a series of large independent medical units, articulated from the spine like the leaves of something that has been waiting to open. In transit, she looks like a warship. In deployment, at full extension, the medical modules open white and broad around the spine, and she looks like nothing else in the fleet. She was deployed now. I could see her at distance, the white modules open against the amber atmospheric haze of Ondrath below her, the escort gunships restive and Patience's blade in tight formation on her flanks, her sensor arrays tracking everything in the system simultaneously. She was not moving toward the Keth Sauron fleet. She did not need to move. She was simply present, deployed, operational, waiting. And the Keth Sauron blockade commander had looked at that profile, and its deflection plating, and its power signature, and the 2 escort gunships, and had apparently concluded that the question of what happened politically if he fired on a UAEN medical asset was more expensive than the question of what happened if he let the evacuation proceed. He was holding for now. I noted this and went back to work. The council chamber seal opened on Merritt's 4th attempt at the verification sequence. I heard it on the command channel, distant, while I was occupied with a Vashari engineer whose lower lattice had sustained a fracture pattern I hadn't encountered in the simulator. The simulator, I have learned, covers about 70% of what the field presents, and the other 30% is what you train your hands to handle without the simulator's help. "They're out," Merritt said on the command channel. 17 council members, multiple walking wounded. I need Haddon's team in the inner ring when you can. 8 minutes, I said. It was 11, because Orvetti found 2 more survivors in the outer ring's connecting junction, pressed behind a sealed equipment panel in a gap that nothing in our scan protocols should have caught, but that Orvetti caught because he has been doing this for 8 years, and he trusts his instincts about where people go when they're afraid. But then we were through the connecting passage and into the inner ring, and the light changed, no gap in the hull here. The Citadel's emergency lighting still running, that characteristic blue-white of the Vashari interior spectrum, designed to optimize visibility for species with lattice-based optics. It made everything look cold and clear and precise, and also very damaged, because the inner ring had not been hit directly, but had absorbed 11 days of vibration transfer from the suppression impacts on the outer structure, and the damage showed in the small things. The cracked ceiling composite, the bench that had shattered along its stress lines, the dust of Vashari mineral composite that had settled over everything like an indoor snowfall. The council chamber was a large ovoid room with a high curved ceiling and a floor of polished mineral that reflected the emergency lights back from below. The Vashari build their governance spaces to feel like extensions of their own bodies, the same mineral composite in the walls that their own lattice is formed from, the same bioluminescent node holders set into the architecture that their own joints carry on their persons. Walking into a Vashari council chamber is like walking into the interior of a very large and very formal version of the species itself. The 17 council members were standing or sitting in clusters, still in their formal robes. Deep iridescent blues and greens and one rust orange, the colors encoding their guild rank within the cartographer's hierarchy. Some of them had used the 11 days to remove the more ceremonial elements of their regalia, the outer collar plates, the sleeve extensions, and others had kept the full formal dress throughout, which I read as a statement about what they had needed to hold onto during the siege. They watched us come through the passage in the particular stillness of people who have been waiting a very long time and are not yet certain that what they are waiting for has arrived. I started with the walking wounded. There were 5 who needed immediate attention, 2 with pressure trauma from the vibration transfer, 1 with a fragment wound, 1 with compromised fluid distribution, the Vashari equivalent of circulatory shock, 1 with a stress fracture in the upper lattice that had been untreated for a week and had shifted in that time in a direction that was going to require careful handling. I triaged and worked in order of urgency. Orvetti and Usul distributing stabilization, supplies to the cases I couldn't reach immediately. The one in fluid distribution failure was the most technically demanding case I saw on Andrath Vel. I had 3 hours of focused prep on that intervention during the transit, and those 3 hours were the reason I didn't lose her on the chamber floor. The intervention requires simultaneously maintaining pressure on 2 separate points of the Vashari's lateral lattice structure, while administering a fluid replacement compound through a port that is, in human anatomical terms, nowhere near where you'd expect it to be. I had Usul on one pressure point, and I held the other with my left hand and administered the compound with my right, and it took 4.5 minutes and she stabilized. The stress fracture in the upper lattice was the second most demanding, because it had gone untreated for a week and had shifted, as I noted, in a direction that would become a significant structural problem if we moved her without addressing it first. I'm not going to describe the procedure in detail here because it's in the medical log, but the relevant fact for this account is that it took 22 minutes and required Orvetti to maintain manual stabilization throughout, which meant he was effectively one-handed for other tasks for 22 minutes, and Usul had to pick up 2 additional walking wounded assessments in that time without prompting. He did. Both of them were processed and staged correctly. I noted it in their personnel records afterward, because that kind of thing deserves to be in the record. The council member who had spoken to me in the chamber came and stood near my station while I was on my 4th patient, not interfering, just present. While I worked, the council members who were not injured stood back. Not hovering, the Vashari are not a hovering species. They give working people room to work, which I have always respected, but watching. I am aware of being watched when I work. 11 years in this job have trained me to let that awareness exist without letting it affect my hands. One of them spoke. The translator in my med kit's external speaker rendered the words in standard 3 seconds after the Vashari finished the sounds. "You are human," the voice said. A statement, not a question. "Yes," I said, without looking up from the pressure assessment I was completing. A pause of about 10 seconds. We received no response from 37 of the 38 councils we contacted, the voice said. "I know," I said. Another pause. The 38th was Earth. "Yes," I said. I finished the pressure assessment. I moved to the next patient. The conversation ended there, because there was nothing else to say about it that the facts hadn't already said, and I had 4 more patients waiting. The evacuation coordination ran on the secondary command channel, while I worked through the council chamber casualties. Lieutenant Commander Merritt was managing the boarding sequence, and Commander Vale, aboard the unyielding patients, was overseeing the full operation, and I was getting the relevant fragments on my earpiece as I moved. The Covenant's medical reception bay prepped for the critical cases, the 2 escort gunships flying a rotation that maintained a presence corridor between the Citadel's docking points and the Kethsaron fleet, the logistics section working through the staging sequence for 111 personnel, across 4 separate docking points with 3 different transport classes. The Kethsaron blockade commander had not made a move. That was the operative fact. I didn't learn until later how close that fact had been to going the other way. Commander Vale told me about it 6 weeks after the operation, in the kind of conversation she has occasionally, where she accounts for a thing in the fewest words possible, and then considers the matter closed. What she said was that the Kethsaron flagship had hailed the unyielding patients on first arrival in system, and asked what the UAEN's intentions were, and Commander Vale had told them that the UAEN's intentions were medical evacuation of civilian and government personnel from a citadel station under blockade. And the Kethsaron commander had pointed out that the unyielding Patience's sensor array and the Covenant of Hours hull profile and the two escort gunships' weapons load were inconsistent with a purely medical operation. Commander Vale had agreed with him. She had then said that she expected the Kethsaron sovereignty would want to consult their legal division regarding the status of firing on UAEN assets engaged in the evacuation of a population under blockade, given that 3 of the treaties the sovereignty had already violated in initiating the blockade were the same treaties that would govern that legal analysis, and that she was happy to wait while that consultation took place. The consultation, according to Vale, took 39 minutes. The Kethsaron then said they would not interfere with the medical operation and asked the unyielding Patience to keep its gunships on the Alliance side of the 400-kilometer line. Commander Vale agreed. She then asked the Covenant of Hours to extend her medical modules to full deployment, which has no tactical function, but has an effect on the silhouette of a ship that is visible to any sensor system in range. The Kethsaron did not comment on this. Neither did Vale. The evacuation proceeded. I want to account for what the evacuation proceeded means in practice, because the phrase flattens something that was not flat. The Covenant of Hours medical reception bay was receiving patients in 3 parallel streams. The critical and surgical cases coming in first by priority, the walking wounded in the second stream, and the stable but depleted cases in the third. I was cycling between the boarding teams and the bay, moving patients and handling the triage calls that the bay physician, Dr. Sen Karat, needed a second assessment on. Karat is a xenobiologist by specialty with 11 years of field medicine across 14 species, and she is the best triage physician I have worked with in my career. She works fast and she works correctly, and when she flagged a case for second assessment, it was because the case was genuinely ambiguous, not because she was uncertain. I got 4 second assessment calls from her in the first 3 hours of the Covenant phase, and all 4 were cases where the right call mattered and the clinical picture was not straightforward. The first was Velith Sor, the structural engineer from Section 5. I had assessed him as early-stage lattice mineral depletion in the field, but Karat's scan showed it was further progressed than my field equipment had been able to detect. The Covenant's diagnostic suite is significantly more sensitive than field kit, and the progression rate suggested he had been in active depletion for 7 days rather than the 3 or 4 I had estimated. That changed his treatment priority. He went from third stream to first. The second was one of the archivists from the server room. Her field assessment had been clean, but the Covenant scan found a stress fracture in her upper lattice that had been forming over the course of the siege, and was close enough to a critical threshold that Karat wanted to consult before deciding whether to intervene surgically or manage it conservatively. We consulted. We decided on conservative management with close monitoring, which proved correct. The fracture stabilized over the next 48 hours. The third and fourth were council members whose 11 days of sustained physiological stress under the siege conditions had produced compound effects that only showed clearly on a full diagnostic scan. Neither was immediately critical. Both required treatment adjustments that the field assessment would not have caught. I note this not because it affects the outcome record, but because it illustrates why the Covenant's deployment was not incidental to the operation's success. She isn't just a way to move patients. She's the difference between the number we recovered and a smaller number. Outside the ship, across the 400 kilometers of the holding pattern, the Kethsaron fleet was still watching. The gunships Restive and Patience's blade were rotating their position relative to the docking corridor in a pattern that Commander Vale had approved, which kept them visible to the Kethsaron sensors without crossing the 400-kilometer line. Visible was the point. The Kethsaron didn't need to see the gunships move. They needed to know the gunships were there, present and capable, which was a different requirement from a tactical one, and one the gunship's crews handled without fanfare. I did not see any of this directly. I was inside the Covenant, at the monitoring station or in the treatment bays or moving between them, doing what the operation required. But I was aware of it on the command channel as a steady background. The rotation updates, the Keth Sauron fleet's unchanged position, Vale's quiet acknowledgments. The competence of a well-run fleet operation has a sound, heard at distance, and it sounds like that. The days that I remember most clearly from Andrath Vel are not the day of the initial boarding, but the second day, when the full patient load had been transferred to the Covenant, and the first surgical outcomes were coming in. I was in the Covenant's medical monitoring bay, updating charts and watching the diagnostic feeds, and the feeds were doing what you want them to do, numbers stable, pressure readings in range, fluid distribution normalizing across the critical cases. And there is a specific quality to that experience, when the numbers that were wrong are becoming right, that I have never been able to describe adequately to anyone who isn't a medic. It is not triumph. It is not relief exactly. It is something more like confirmation. The world is arranged correctly for this moment. The interventions have held. The outcomes are going where they should go. The young council aide with the fragment wound was in bed 7 of the general recovery section. His diagnostics were clean, the extraction had held, the tissue sealant was performing as specified, his fluid distribution was strong. His bioluminescent nodes were running steady, and even the warm amber that I had learned from the cultural briefing indicates something like comfortable rest. He was asleep. In the Vashari way of sleeping, which looks from the outside like a very still form of being awake, the lattice structure unchanged and upright but the node light low and unhurried. I looked at his diagnostic feed for a moment, confirmed everything I was seeing, made a note in his chart and moved on. The council member who had spoken to me in the chamber came to find me that afternoon. She was in a recovery bed herself, the pressure trauma case, healing well, but she had permission from the Covenant's duty physician to move around the ward, and she found me at the monitoring station and stood in the aisle beside it and waited until I finished what I was doing. I wanted to say something, she said, through the translator. Her nodes were running at a pattern I was getting better at reading, something in the slower range, deliberate, the frequency of a considered communication rather than a reactive one. All right, I said. When the signal went out 36 days ago, she said, I told the council that we would hear from the assembly within a week, that we had the treaty record and the legal standing and the relationship history, and that the assembly would act. She paused. I was wrong about that. I waited. When 10 days passed, I told them we would hear within the month, that the assembly moved slowly, but it moved. Another pause. I was wrong about that too. I know, I said. When the 38th day came, she said, I told them nothing, because I had stopped believing in what I was saying and I did not want to keep saying it. Her node cycled through something. I watched it, trying to read it. And then your fleet came, she said. Yes, I said. She was quiet for a moment. We did not send a signal to Earth, she said. The signal went to 38 councils. Earth was not among them. I had known this. It was in the signal documentation. The UAEN monitoring station at Meridian picked up the distress signal on the General Alliance broadcast relay, I said. Standard protocol is to treat any assembly distress signal received on the relay as an open call. We don't require a direct address. She looked at me for a long time. You came without being asked, she said. We came because the signal was in the system, and the parameters triggered a response protocol, I said. The address field on the distress signal is logged, but not a prerequisite for dispatch. She understood what I was saying, and I think she also understood what I was not saying, which is that the difference between those two framings of the same fact matters less than the 111 living people in the Covenant's wards. I see, she said. She returned to her recovery bed. I went back to my charts. The evacuation of Andrathvel took 2 days in total to complete. The initial boarding on day 1 for the inner ring and the accessible outer ring sections, and a second operation on day 2 for the 31 survivors in the lower maintenance sections, whom a secondary boarding team reached after clearing the access corridors on the first pass. By the end of day 2, the Covenant had 111 patients. The unyielding patients had the council members who were medically cleared for standard transport, and the Keth Sauron fleet had not moved from its holding position. The second day was different from the first in the way that second days always are. The initial adrenaline of the boarding is gone, and what remains is the sustained attention of doing the work completely rather than quickly. The lower maintenance sections of Andrathvel were below the main ring structure, accessed through a series of service shafts that the suppression fire had blocked with debris at 3 separate points. The engineering team from the unyielding patients, 4 people, on loan to the boarding party for this purpose, cleared those blockages in sequence methodically, without hurrying and without dawdling, which is the correct pace for debris clearance when you don't know what's on the other side of each blockage. What was on the other side of the first blockage was a maintenance corridor with 11 survivors. What was on the other side of the second was a large equipment bay where 9 more had sheltered, with access to the station's emergency supply caches that the outer ring survivors had not had. They were better off nutritionally and showed it. Their nodes were brighter, their movements more considered. What was on the other side of the third blockage was a server room housing 11 more, including 3 Vashari who had been maintaining the Citadel Ring's archival and navigational data servers throughout the siege, running on the server room's independent power supply, keeping the records intact. I want to note that, because the Vashari are a cartographic species and their archival data is the core of what they do and what they have always done. And these 3 people had spent 11 days in a server room keeping the records of 600 years of Vashari cartographic work intact, while suppression fire came through the hull above them. And they had done it correctly. And when the engineering team opened the third blockage and the rescue team came through, the first thing one of them said, through the translator, was, "The primary archive is intact. The navigational database is intact. We have been logging damage reports to the secondary systems for transmission when communication was restored." They had a stack of transmission logs. 11 days of logs, carefully formatted, ready to send. I processed them through triage the same as everyone else, confirmed they were well enough to walk to the docking point under their own power, and told them the archive would be verified and backed up aboard the Covenant. Then I moved on, because there were 31 people in those lower sections, and I was one of 2 medics working that sweep, and I had a lot of ground to cover. I was present for the moment the last transport locked off from Andrathvel's docking ring, because I was on the transport doing a final medical check of the 8 walking wounded in my care. The transport's pilot, a UAEN flight officer named Cressida Yor, who had been flying these operations for 7 years, and who handles an evacuation shuttle the way a very experienced surgeon handles an instrument without apparent effort, with complete attention, said on the intercom, in the flat voice of someone filing a notation rather than making a statement, "Last transport away. Docking ring is clear." I heard it from the passenger compartment. I noted it in my log. Then we were in the black, and Andrathvel was behind us, and below it Andrath was a copper-orange arc in the ambient light, and the Keth Sauron fleet was still holding, and the Covenant was ahead of us with her medical modules still deployed, white against the dark and the distant amber of the planet below. Mercy Base 7 had room for approximately 200 personnel in its standard configuration. The UAEN engineering team, 12 people, the support section attached to the unyielding patients, spent 72 hours reconfiguring it for Vashari habitation. Different atmospheric mix, different lighting spectrum, Mineral composite wall panels replacing the standard steel in the primary common areas. Vashari standard furniture fabricated from materials in the resupply cargo, because there was no point housing a 111-person Vashari population in a station designed for human comfort. The engineering team's lead was Warrant Officer Dembai Tark, who looks like she has never slept in her life and possibly hasn't. She submitted a resupply request to Fleet Command for the additional materials needed, and the request ran to 43 line items: atmospheric compounds, composite fabrication stock, lighting system modifications, nutritional supplies, medical monitoring equipment specific to Vashari physiology, and every one of them was approved within 6 hours of submission, and every delivery arrived within 36 hours, which is fast for a resupply at the edge of a contested sector. I mention this because it is the kind of thing that doesn't appear in the tactical accounts. The fight for the outer ring appears. The Covenant's deployment appears. The Keth Sauron withdrawal appears. Dembai Tark's 43 line items don't appear, but they are the part of the operation that meant the 111 survivors of Andrathvel had somewhere to go that felt like somewhere rather than a holding area. I was at Mercy Base 7 for 9 days before the unyielding patients departed for its next rotation, and those 9 days were quieter than the operation but not less important. Medical follow-up, nutritional protocol checks, the 3 cases that needed extended monitoring, Velith Sore, the archivist with the managed stress fracture, and a 4th case that had emerged in transit, a council member whose reserve depletion proved more systemic than the initial presentation suggested. All 3 were stabilizing, all 3 would be well. The base in those 9 days was becoming itself. The Vashari are not passive inhabitants of a space. They organize it. The archivists from the server room, their names were Teth Vel Orith, Saneth Vel Korin, and Ondavil Vel Sarith, had requested workstations on the 2nd day, and Tark's team had built them by the 3rd day, and by the 4th day the archival work had resumed. The survey charts, the navigational databases, the damage reports that had been queued for transmission since the siege began and were now going out on the Covenant's relay. Mapping work, the patient kind, the kind that has been going on for 600 years and will go on for 600 more. The council members whose injuries were healed began meeting informally in the common corridor during the 2nd week. Not formally, the first formal session came later, but informally, in the way that people who have governance responsibilities and a crisis to process start to work through that process, standing in corridors and speaking quietly, their nodes running at the frequencies I was learning to recognize as deliberate rather than reactive. I passed those conversations daily on my way to the medical bay. I did not participate in them. They were not mine to participate in. What I noticed, passing them, was that the conversations were increasingly about the future rather than the siege. What the Citadel Ring would require to be made habitable again. What the status of the navigation treaty filing should be in the upcoming assembly session. What the Vashari's formal position should be on the Keth Sauron's violations, given the current diplomatic posture. The work of a governance body resuming in a reconfigured human resupply station, 9 days after a siege and an evacuation. I noticed it, and I kept walking and I went to work. I need to say something about Vershandeth Vel Catholic. He was aboard the Covenant during the transit to Mercy Base 7. He was in the general population ward. His injuries hadn't required the surgical bays or the specialized care units. He was walking wounded with stress fractures in his lower lattice that were healing adequately and a reserve depletion condition that primarily needed rest and nutritional support. He was in the section of the ward nearest the monitoring station, and I walked past his bed frequently on my rounds. On the 2nd day of transit, a message came to my duty log requesting that the medical officer responsible for the outer ring evacuation speak with him at his convenience. I went to the ward after the morning rounds. He was sitting up in the medical bunk. The Covenant's bunks adjust to accommodate different species morphologies, and his was set to the Vashari configuration, a flat surface with lateral support struts rather than edges. He was in standard Covenant medical garments, the generic issue that fits everyone imprecisely and is designed to be easy to remove in a medical situation. His nodes were running at a steadier frequency than during the evacuation. 11 days in a crisis suit that didn't fit him well had given way to rest and consistent nutrition, and the difference was visible in the regularity of the light. He looked at me for a while after I came in. "You were in the outer ring," he said. "Yes." "From the first boarding?" "Yes." He was quiet, his nodes shifted. "We maintained the seal on the council chamber for 11 days, he said. "We received intermittent signal from the outer ring. We stopped receiving survivor reports after the 4th day, and we concluded that the outer ring had lost atmosphere completely." A pause. "We did not know about the survivors." 31 of them across sections 4 through 6, I said. "The atmospheric loss was partial. A structural anomaly in the outer hull kept those sections sealed despite the breach." "And you found them?" "Yes." He looked at the wall beside his bunk. The wall was still standard Covenant steel at this point. The Mercy Base 7 reconfiguration hadn't started yet, and I think he was looking at the material of it, the human-built surface, the particular quality of something that was competently made but not made by his people. "I know what fleet you serve," he said. "I know the provenance of this ship. I know the position papers." He paused. "I am the person who wrote the most recent one." "I know," I said. "I read it." That landed differently than he expected. I could tell by the shift in his nodes, the pattern I was still learning but had come to associate with recalibration. "You read it," he said. "I had transit time, and I like to understand who I'm going to help." I read the distress signal, the assembly responses, the treaty documentation, and the position papers. All 7 of them. A pause. "And you came anyway?" "I came to do my job," I said. "The job was the evacuation and medical support of the population of Andrathvel. That's what I did." I want to be clear about the register of that statement because I can hear how it reads. I wasn't being cold. I was being accurate. I had come to do my job. The job included him, the same as it included the council aide in bed 7 and the administrator in the corner of the outer ring and the 3 who were gone before I reached them. The job is not conditional on the history. The job is the job, and I have been doing it long enough to know that making it anything other than the job is how you start to lose the clarity you need to do it well. He received that for a long moment. "The other councils," he said, "the 37. The UAEN observer mission arrived 4 days after the evacuation was complete," I said. 3 councils have sent formal expressions of retroactive support since the Keth-Sauron withdrawal was confirmed." He received that too, without moving. 4 days after, he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. His nodes were doing something I didn't have the vocabulary for, not then. It was only later, reviewing the cultural briefing supplemental that the Covenant's xenobiology section had compiled for this operation, that I found the pattern described. The documentation called it the node signature of acknowledged debt, not the Vashari word for owing something that can be repaid, but the word for a category of debt that has no repayment mechanism because what was given cannot be matched. I didn't know that during the conversation. I saw the pattern and I noted it and I filed it. "I have a request to make," Vershandeth said. "Go ahead." "I would like to submit a standard boarding form for passage on a UAEN transport during the resettlement phase," he said. "The Council has agreed to accept accommodation at Mercy Base 7 pending the diplomatic resolution. I would like to be processed through the standard UAEN transport protocol." The standard boarding form, the same form every other evacuee from Andrathvel had filled out. Standard UAEN evac form, universal format, species designation, identity credential, medical status, transport priority, destination preference. "I'll have it sent to you through the Covenant's patient services system," I said. "You can submit it electronically when it's convenient." "Thank you," he said. I asked him the standard follow-up medical questions, confirmed his condition was stable, noted the healing progress on his lower lattice fractures, told him the rest and nutrition protocol the Covenant's physician had prescribed, and left the ward. I countersigned Vashari Cathic's boarding form 2 days later as the medical officer of record for his case. He was allocated a berth on the logistics frigate Unyielding Patience for the transit to Mercy Base 7, along with 9 other council members who were medically cleared for standard transport rather than continued Covenant care. The transit took 36 hours. I was on the Unyielding Patience for the first leg, and then transferred to the Covenant for the last 12 hours to assist with the patient handovers at Mercy Base 7. When I came aboard the Covenant for that last leg, I went first to the General Recovery Ward. The council aide, Sarithvel Ondeth, junior cartographer 3rd tier, I had his full name from his patient record now, was sitting up in bed 7 reading from a data tablet. His nodes were lit clear and warm. His diagnostic feed read normal across everything I could see from the monitoring station. He looked up when I came into the ward. I nodded at him. He returned the gesture, the Vashari equivalent, a slight inclination of the upper body, and then went back to his reading. That was the conversation. It was enough. The Vashari Council of Cartographers held its first session at Mercy Base 7 11 days after arrival. The session ran 4 hours. The proceedings were not shared with the UAEN, as is appropriate. They are an independent governance body conducting their internal affairs. What I know is that, when the session ended, the council members came out into the main corridor of Mercy Base 7 and stood there for a while, and their nodes were cycling at patterns I could see from the junction at the end of the corridor, and I couldn't read all of those patterns precisely, but I could read enough of them to know they weren't distress signals. 3 months after the evacuation, the Vashari Council of Cartographers submitted a new position paper to the Assembly of Worlds on the question of humanity's membership status. I saw a summary on the General Advisory Channel. I read the full text 2 days after it was released to the public record, the way I read everything relevant to operations in my sector, completely, once, noting the parts that affect my job. The paper reversed the previous position on every substantive point. It argued that humanity's demonstrated capacity for rapid, large-scale humanitarian response, independent of Assembly authorization, in the face of Assembly inaction, triggered by protocol rather than by personal or political relationship, constituted a governance function that the Assembly had structurally failed to provide, and that the exclusion of such a capacity from formal voting membership represented a design flaw in the Assembly's architecture rather than a considered policy choice. The paper requested that the Assembly expedite the membership review. It was signed by all 17 surviving council members. It was also signed, in a separate attestation section, by Vashari Catholic. I read it once. I noted it in my personal log. Then I filed it in the part of my mind where I put things that are real and important and not mine to carry as feelings, because my feelings about it were not the point. The point was that 111 Vashari were alive and housed and governing, and that Dembi Tark's 43 line items had all been delivered on schedule, and that Sarithvel Ondeth's fragment wound had healed cleanly, which the Covenant's 60-day follow-up report confirmed when it came in. The Assembly notification arrived 6 weeks after the paper. The membership review had been expedited. It would begin in the next session. I am writing this report now, 68 days after the conclusion of operations at Andrathvel, seated in the medical bay of the ESV unyielding patients, which is 3 days out from Meridian Station on its next patrol rotation. I have 30 hours of Vashari medical anatomy to review for the rotation, because the review board has identified 3 more stations in the outer reach with significant Vashari populations and uncertain security situations, and I like to go into operations prepared. I have one more thing to say, and then this account is complete. 6 days before I finished this report, I received a data packet through the standard UAEN communications relay. It was marked as originating from Mercy Base 7, patient routing, a follow-up communication from a patient to a treating medical officer, which is a normal category of communication and comes through the relay automatically. Inside the packet was a short message, in Vashari text with an attached standard translation that the Mercy Base 7 Xenobiology Station had provided. The translation read, "The charts are good work, Soreth vel ondeth." It took me a moment to work out what he meant. Then I remembered, when I walked past his workspace in the corridor at Mercy Base 7, the week before the unyielding patients departed, he had been working on trade lane survey charts for the outer reach. The desk surface that Tark's team had installed for him was the correct mineral composite. The lighting spectrum was correct. The charts were spread across the surface in the organized pattern that the cultural briefing described as standard Vashari working method. Everything visible simultaneously, nothing stacked, the full field of work laid out flat so the whole of it can be understood at once. What he meant, I think, was that the outer reach charts he was working on were good, accurate, usable, the kind of cartographic work that the Vashari have been doing for 600 years and intend to keep doing. I replied through the relay, "Good, Haddon." I submitted the complete operations log for Andrathvel to the review board the following morning. The summary section under overall assessment reads as it has read since I first filed it 68 days ago. Population of 1,211, recovered 111, 38 councils received the distress signal, 1 responded. Assessment: the operation succeeded within the parameters of what remained possible. My name is Senior Corpsman Rael Haddon, ESV Unyielding Patients. I have been doing this job for 11 years. I expect to keep doing it for a while yet.